I am shocked by this number.
Right.
So I said on GB News yesterday that inflation in April was 8.7%, and it would be bad if inflation didn't at the very least start with a 7, and it would probably be somewhere between 7 and 8%. We had some food price inflation numbers, unofficial yesterday, that were alarming. Inflation in May is unchanged at 8.7%, and this is an extremely eyebrow-raising number. British inflation had been coming down quite steadily from the peak of 11.1% back in the autumn. Rishi Sunak has staked his reputation on inflation falling to 5% by the end of the year. But the fact that inflation hasn't moved, even though inflation in the US is now down at 4%, inflation in the Eurozone is at 6.1%, the fact that UK inflation has stubbornly remained at 8.7% suggests that the Bank of England is going to come under scrutiny to take drastic action. The headline here for ordinary folk listening and watching GB News is that the cost of living crisis, as they will know, is not budging. It's stubbornly remaining. And I haven't drilled down into the sub-data. I can't yet get on the site. No wonder it's crashing. But I predict this is driven largely by food prices.
Right. So the government's going to come under a lot of pressure.
This is going to dominate politics for the next 3 to 6 months at least.
But what could the government have done? What could the government do to improve this figure?
Well, the government is going to have to hold very muscular conversations with food retailers, with other people in the supply chain. The government is also going to have to think very hard when it comes to negotiating more with the public sector unions. Of course, this will have knock-on effects. The public sector unions, and indeed other private sector workers, when they talk to their employers, will say, look, we can't deal with 3 or 4% wage rises when inflation isn't coming down. It's still at 8.7%. I was seen to be among the economics commentariat at the kind of more hawkish, more concerned end of the spectrum when I was saying yesterday I think inflation is going to be around 8%. I was getting a bit of a drubbing on Twitter, but it's still at 8.7%. This is really surprising, and I don't want to be alarmist, but I do think now the UK will come to be seen as an outlier when it comes to inflation, and it's going to spark a lot of conversations about how we run our monetary policy, the Bank of England's independence, why the Bank of England was so slow to start raising interest rates, and whether or not, had they started earlier, got on top of those inflation expectations, we wouldn't have had to have interest rates so high for so long. We're going to see on the gilts market, the government bond market, yields rising, and I'm afraid mortgage rates rising. I don't like to be overly gloomy, but I've been reporting economics for 30 years, and this is, for me, a really shocking moment.
Yeah, we can see that you are really surprised by the figures. I mean, that is tangible from you. I mean, I know these have literally just come through now, but what would you predict would happen now with the Bank of England interest rates decision tomorrow?
Well, at the very least, there's going to be a rise of 0.25%, so interest rates at the Bank of England will go up from 4.5 to 4.75, but there will now be incredibly fraught discussions among the 9 members of the Monetary Policy Committee, including the Bank of England Governor, Andrew Bailey, about whether or not they should go for half a percentage point, so a rise from 4.5% to 5%. This is the Bank of England's what we call the base rate. It sets the tone for all other interest rates, by definition in the economy, are above that rate. So when the Bank of England base rate goes up by 0.5%, you can expect most variable rate mortgages to go up by around 0.5% plus the mortgage company's markup. That's the way the world works. We know that, Ellie, every month now, hundreds of thousands of households are moving off 5, 3 and 2 year fixed rate mortgages that by definition were deals struck between 2017 and 2021. Between 2017 and 2021, mortgage rates were 1 or 2%, right? Because base rates were 0.1, 0.5%, very, very low. So you're going to get a lot of households, a lot of young people with kids working hard, mum and dad working. Their mortgage rates are going to go from sort of between 1 and 3% to between, 6 and 7%.
It's a huge jump.
And this is going to be a really big jump. Now, a lot of people say to me, somebody stopped me on the street outside GB News this morning, actually, and said, oh, back in my day, we had interest rates of 15%, didn't do us any harm. All these youngsters, they eat too many avocado sandwiches, they should go away to Ibiza a bit less. I'm afraid that's completely wrong, because even though interest rates are lower than they were, people who've bought houses in the last 10 years have had to buy a house at a much, much higher price as a share of their income. So they're just to buy a regular house, nothing flash, just a regular house. And so they are more indebted. And that does make today's youngsters, Stephen, again, it pains me to say they're spending more on their mortgages and on rent, and they're less likely to own their own home than any generation since the 1930s. So this is going to send housing affordability and the housing issue in general to the top of the political agenda for a long time to come.
Is this then, I know I'm being yelled at because we're out of time, but this is important. This is important. Is this thing, what impact does this then have on the housing market? Is this going to cause prices to at least stabilise or drop? OK,
I think we've already seen prices dropping on some metrics for the last few months. There's not been any sudden crash, but I know a lot of younger people in the GB News newsroom and people that email me and contact me on Twitter, they want to see a price fall because that might give them a chance of getting on the ladder and getting their own home. The fact is, Stephen, there's just such a fundamental shortage of homes in this country. We've been so bad at building homes for so many years, and there's been, pressure from demography, from immigration and so on, that fundamental mismatch of supply and demand in most parts of the country, I don't think we're going to see a big fall. What we are going to see, though, and this is tough, we're going to see houses changing hands. We're going to see people who can't afford their mortgages anymore having to give up their houses, and, investors or cash-rich people coming in and buying them. What I would say, just try and put a bit of a positive note on this, the banking sector is not nearly as rickety as it was back in 2007-8. I don't think this is going to cause a sort of systemic meltdown, and that is really worth... Let's put that in the back pocket and be grateful for that. So I think that's important. What I'd also say is that there's still a sense that the housing market in general is quite stable, and I think what we're going to see is people taking in lodgers. We're going to see the mortgage companies coming under pressure from the government now not to repossess, to give people lots of slack. We're going to see mortgage companies saying to householders whose mortgage rates are going up, look, we're not going to repossess you, but how about you switch your mortgage for now from 25 years to 35 years to try and keep your repayments down? How about you switch from a repayment mortgage to an interest-only mortgage where you don't pay down the principal, you just pay the interest? So, again, to get your monthly numbers down. Look,
So they're going to have to come up with some options.
I do think this inflation will come down quite soon, but it's very, very surprising, and it will be noticed around the world that for now British inflation is stubbornly high, and so British interest rates are going to stay high too.